There was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around other people's elections, Jim?
All right. Welcome to the latest episode of the Rackets podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sadie, and I have the great pleasure of introducing a really fascinating guest. His name is Dave Moore. He's an independent candidate for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District of South Carolina. How's it going, Dave?
Pretty good. And I'm third party, American Party South Carolina. It's basically independent, yes, but, you know.
What is the name of the party?
American Party South Carolina.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. You seem to have a pretty diverse array of political opinions. If I had to basically summarize from what I've looked at your platform, I would say it's devoid of financial conflicts of interest. But if you would, we're going to get into the issues in a bit, but could you maybe just give us kind of a little brief bit of background on your sort of ideology or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm 65, and so I've been around a while, and I've seen the parties devolve. I'm a mishmash. I think like a lot of Americans are. One could call me, a Jim Webb Democrat, an Eisenhower Republican, because, you look at the marginal tax rate. When you go through my website, you will see a lot of things that, mimic Eisenhower, and I give credit where credit is due. And I think a lot of Americans, what is right-wing, left-wing, conservative, liberal? Mm-hmm. I could be very liberal on, like education mm-hmm. and such, and, individual rights. But what one would now say with that, I'm very conservative in other issues. I can be very libertarian, for instance, mm-hmm. I oppose the drug war and, looking for prison reform. So I think, when you actually speak to, I would say, the majority of Americans, and that's what the American Party is, they don't really have like this sort of corporate or one specific outlook. There are people that run the full gamut. And actually, it was started by a Democrat and a Republican, and what they're looking for is, one was a football coach in college also, and so we're looking for the people between both 30-yard lines.
Okay. That's a good analogy.
We're not looking for extreme left or extreme right or anybody that's got just a one-note Johnny on. It's like if they're interested in only one topic or something, then it's like, well, don't bother voting for me because I'm just not making that my big thing.
Right. No, I think that's a great analogy, actually. Yeah, and that's how I would describe you. Just from the outside looking in, pretty moderate. You have an array of ideas. Personally, I love that. That's why I wanted to get you on the show. I'm sick and tired of, really these cookie cutter candidates. If they're Republican, they just go right down the list. They do what they're told, or at least what their donors tell them they're supposed to do, and it's the same thing on the left. And nobody really thinks for themselves. And I really don't believe that those people really have those views. I think that most people do have a diverse viewpoint and look at issues independently. In fact, most polls show that the average American voter is completely upset with both parties, and they have basically a pretty independent view.
And the thing is, people call it a broken. I disagree with a lot where people say it's a broken system, and I remind them, and I did that in my convention speech. I said it's not broken for them. They rake in $1 billion a year, both parties, Democrat and Republican. And it's over 90% of, corporate. And Bill Clinton turned it, to Wall Street and, away from the bread and butter of the Democratic Party. but yet you look at them. They go back and forth. They go into the DNC. They become a lobbyist, and this $1 billion pays for this whole army of consultants and people who don't know what they're talking about, and these so-called Cato Institute or what have you that just mimic and say, oh yes, so and so is correct. This is what we need to do. And like I said, it works pretty good for them.
Right. Right. Them being and again, it's part of what the title of the podcast. It's Rackets. So I'm looking at
exactly.
Capitol Hill, and in my opinion, that's one of the biggest rackets out there, and all of the.
Like your 3 books. Like your 3 books. Pick a topic. It's like, they're in the pocket. They're just a sock puppet for somebody there. And, they're going to mimic that, and then they're going to be taken care of later on.
Yeah, exactly. It's a system where you make, I think it's like roughly a little under $200,000 in Congress, but the real payday is when you go become a lobbyist, or like you say, a consultant, or you go work in the private sector and use that to leverage that, all of those different relationships. To benefit a small few versus the general public. So, okay, so I guess the one thing, the first thing that I'm really wondering is, was there maybe like a singular incident that motivated you to run for Congress? I know that you've obviously been very fascinated in all of these types of topics, but what was it that pushed you to make this commitment?
The epiphanous moment, the burning bush. The thing was, QTC Medical Services, I'm a veteran, Vietnam veteran, and I do have some disabilities from Vietnam. And, one of the biggest problems, there's a great book, Waiting for an Army to Die, but, everybody says, deny, hope you die. There's a real problem where you have real doctors you go to and they say, oh, he has a kidney condition or this or that. That's recognized by the VA. And so the VA then contracts out to a group. They get 2/3 of it, about $6 billion a year, QTC Medical Services, which is now part of Lockheed Martin, which is very convenient, which is also the largest, $40 billion a year in government contracts. Mm-hmm. But QTC was known as just, flat deny. And the thing was, I wrote to Jeff Duncan, and I told him, look, I was a victim of QTC Medical. And actually what happened, I'm going to do a Facebook Live on it and have the documents there. QTC called me, and all it was just a simple blood test, and it would have showed that I had this issue. And I don't want to say it, but anyway, the guy just either is a quack or because he just wanted to deny it. And I'm going to have his name because I'm going to have the documents, but I won't put it on your show. Okay. But at any rate, so, the VA didn't quite know what to do, And so I wrote to the Virginia Medical Board, and I said, look, this guy's a quack. What the hell? People are being victimized by this, and he shouldn't be allowed to be doing this. Well, the medical board wrote back to me and said, we don't want to get involved. So I wrote to the IG or the general counsel, I can't remember, of the VA. Now, you would think, they're supposed to be protecting.
Right, that's supposed to be the independent party, right, that's monitoring this against any kind of conflict of interest or any sort of corruption.
Yeah, and I wrote to them and I showed it and said, look, this guy should not be, reviewing cases of veterans. This is just total quackery or whatever, but, he's victimizing people and costing a lot of money, too.
Right.
And what did they do? They sent me a letter back and said, you need to get a private attorney.
Wow. That was the IG?
But at any rate,
the IG responded that way?
That was in the 90s. And And so anyway, I wrote to Duncan and said, this has been going on a long time. You're reviewing 400,000 cases of QTC Medical, and they were paying them $400 a case, and they were supposed to be spending 1 hour on each case. They were spending 5 minutes. And so, they were going to have this. And I said, look, these people have been doing this for 20 years. There's actually on my website, you can see my interview on QTC Medical about this. And Duncan took he took real offense, and his spokesman said, no, Dave Moore's lying. And it's like, I got the emails. And when I called his office, the girl answered the phone and said, well, either he'll answer you or he won't, and she hung up on me. So, I mean,
that's your tax dollars at work right there.
Yeah, and so you talk about that. That's a pretty heavy epiphanous moment. It's like, wait a minute, because he never served, and he wants to call himself a conservative, and that's where I'm conservative. Everybody in my family has served. Since the revolution on, even the women. Right. We deserve better, and if I may just do a little side joint here. My grandfather was badly wounded at World War I, and that's on my website. And he was charged for his bandages. He was a Marine. And this depended where you were sent to, and he languished for a couple of years. And so he co-founded the Disabled American Veterans. It's like, no, we deserve better.
Right.
And I still have his DAV post number 1 uniform. And anyway, we're kind of back to those days. When the IG wrote back to me and said, you're on your own, dude. Wow. Why don't you get an attorney? I'm not going to investigate fraud. Right. And so anyway, that's why I say, I'm pretty angry about it, and I'm sure it comes through. And it was like,
justifiably so. And justifiably so.
And, I want everybody to know, and it's like Duncan wins 80 to 20% every election cycle. He gets $1 million a cycle. He doesn't even need to try, and it shows. Right. So that's why that's my moment. Yeah.
He seems to be a lot. And again, you mentioned he didn't serve. One thing I always like to point to, Ron Paul always pointed out that that some of his biggest supporters were former Army veterans. There's this sort of nexus where a lot of folks who didn't serve, they're these war hawks, yet they're always handing off the money for the big corporations. But then when it comes to things like reforming the VA, nothing really ever gets done. It's very big on the talk to get us into war, but then afterwards,
like John Bolton and Cheney. And by the way, there's you can Google it, Chicken Hawk Database of a New Hampshire Gazette. And that's what they're known as, chicken hawks. Yep. And it has all these people listed and how many deferments they filed.
Like our current president. Again, the VA was one of his big campaign issues. And there was a report recently just talking about how whistleblower retaliation, there's been nothing really done to correct any of the actual, because there's a lot of whistleblower retaliation within that agency.
Oh, yeah.
As you can obviously infer, and you probably know firsthand.
Yeah, I was even one myself on a much lower scale, but yeah, I mean, you try and bring an issue up, and they kill the messenger every time.
Okay. Well, just to kind of backtrack, for the listeners, you mentioned the name Jeff Duncan. He's the incumbent in your district there.
Yes.
One thing that I came across that I found really interesting when I just looked up his record, according to govtrack.org, he is actually the most right-wing member of the House. Yeah. The absolute extreme, not towards it, the absolute most extreme member in the House. Whereas again, your platform, you're a pretty moderate guy, I would definitely say. So defense is definitely one of the issues that he attaches himself to. My question would be, and again, you're alluding to it already. How do you differ on the issue of defense?
Well, I mean, you can also look at, he and the Republican Party get quite a bit of money from, the defense industry. What, of course, Eisenhower warned us about 80 years, 70 years ago. Right. But, a general warning us.
Right.
But, and president. But you can take a look, we spend as much money as the top, 12 or 15, China, Russia, and that. And it's really quite
combined, right?
Yeah, combined. It's quite a con on us. And if you look at Russia, just as an example, their how much they spend is like 1/10, but because they don't have that corruption, of, buying congressmen, and like the F-35 can't fly it in the rain. It's killed a number of pilots.
Right.
$1.5 trillion so far, and the thing still doesn't work.
And the funding keeps going towards.
Yeah,
it as
and
well.
they just just another $500 billion and we'll fix it. But yet Russia doesn't have that problem, and the other countries don't. And so they develop what they need, like an aircraft carrier supersonic missile, that can down an aircraft carrier. And they had a war game, a NATO war game, and Russia actually beat the NATO forces. And here they're just buying hand over fist,
Right.
weapons from us. And it's like, we haven't won a war in God knows how many decades. And, we're going bankrupt over Ron Paul, I just totally agree with him on so many things. We can't afford this. And it's such a corrupting influence now of all these systems that don't work and cost us billions and billions. And one F-22, just one, is the same cost as manning and equipping an entire division of 15,000 men and women.
Right. Yeah.
So we only have 33 combat brigades, and we're running these guys into the ground.
Right.
With this high tempo, and that's what I mean. Duncan and the others are like, yes, we need to go to Syria. Yes, we need to bomb Yemen. Yes, we need to do this and that. Well, I don't see your kids out there.
Right. So basically, to sum up, overly succinct, you have a very non-interventionist view as far as foreign policy, it sounds.
Yeah, just like the founding fathers. We should not be going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Mm-hmm. And we really should. It's like trade with all, but we don't get involved in other people's wars. And we've just gotten so far afield of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what's really fueling it is that military-industrial complex. It is that revolving door from these high-level military officials. They go into the private sector.
Oh, yeah.
And I read a pretty interesting example on your website related to Jim Comey. If you don't mind, would you just would you expand upon that? It's a really interesting example.
Well, people forget about him, and I got attacked, a couple of times over that, and I said, hey, the guy Comey doesn't make a secret of what he did. I'm not pulling this out of a hat.
Right.
But, he was a U.S. attorney, and Lockheed Martin, one of their dozens of offenses, and,
exactly.
a criminal
Pick
offense.
and choose. You can throw a dart.
Yeah, it's like, who knows which one. But at any rate, he worked out, pay the usual, pay 1/10 of your ill-gotten gains, and we give you a deferred prosecution. And again, I don't understand how you have, 85 deferred prosecutions.
Right. You promise not to do it again. Right.
Usually it's one, and then you go to jail, like parole or something. But
that's for a regular person in the population. Totally different rules for the corporate class.
Yeah, it's a two-tier justice system. But at any rate, so less than a year later, he's the general counsel for Lockheed Martin.
Right.
For 5 years. And he worked out while he was there, again, the same thing, a deferred prosecution, pay a fine.
Right.
And, he likes to pull that Huck Finn, oh gosh, stuff.
Right.
And, me and my wife's tattered coat,
Right.
and, the pumpkin speech or, Checkers speech. And it's like, but he didn't tell people he had $11 million,
Right.
He got $8 million or something from Lockheed Martin as general counsel, and he got like $3 million from a hedge fund.
Yeah.
And, so he goes back and says, well, I'm just going to have to take a real cut and pay here, $180,000 a year, and I'll serve my country, and it's like, you got $11 million.
Right. And it's
I'll
not
never
just
see
him. It's not, and it's not really just to single him out, but it's a
he's
perfect
a small
example.
player, yeah.
Right. That basically is the standing operating procedure in D.C. Exactly. You get You get that gig, and then you go move on to the private sector, protecting these corporate criminals. You do that for a while, then you go back into the government. You keep bouncing back and forth, and increasing your value in the private sector.
Yeah, well, they got to relearn those federal laws.
Develop
violate
new
a number of laws got passed, so they have to come back in and kind of work in the sector again, so they could know how to cheat it.
Right. There's one thing I did want to talk to you about that I found particularly interesting. I think it touches upon a couple of things in your platform. Jeff Duncan, he's sponsoring a bill. I don't remember the exact wording, but it's basically called the Hezbollah Prevention Act.
I read it, yeah.
Basically, and what it is for listeners, it's something to where they want to sort of coordinate with the State Department to try and deter any sort of terrorist activities that Hezbollah is involved in. They're involved in a lot of different sort of black market crimes, such as illegal contraband cigarettes, bootleg cigarettes, drug trafficking, etc. And my point, and I think it sort of blends with your viewpoint, is that the best way to fight that is actually to end the drug war. Let's take away the whole black market.
Totally, yeah.
In general, there was a recent report by the Counter Extremism Project and a group called Asymmetrica. They estimated in the tri-border region, which is where Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay borders. It's basically like this smuggler's paradise. And their estimate was that there's $43 billion in illegal profits, and a whole lot of that benefits Hezbollah. They've got a lot of operatives in that region of the world. And again, it just gets back to my original point that if we can
probably the bulk goes for bribes.
What's that?
Sorry, but I mean, probably the bulk of that goes for bribes. Yes.
Oh yeah, and there's just all kinds. That particular area, it's a money laundering haven. A lot of counterfeit goods. Again, the bootleg cigarettes. That's where actually a lot of that actually has to do with the lame duck president in Paraguay, a guy called Horacio Cartes. He actually owns the cigarette company that is the main producer of those bootleg cigarettes throughout Latin America. In other words, the taxes are super low in Paraguay, and they're much higher in these other Latin American countries, and they get smuggled in. Groups like Hezbollah and different cartels, they make a ton of money off of this stuff. But again, really the biggest driver of all that money is the drug war. And there was one other thing just to point out to the listeners. There was a recent report in, I think it was I can't remember, Politico. They did it. It was reporting on a project by the DA called Project Cassandra, and it had to do with
that's a good name,
right? With tons of cocaine that was trafficked by Hezbollah with different Latin American cartels. But again, it gets back to they're making a ton of money off of this stuff. But again, it wouldn't even be possible. The best way to take away their funding is to end the war on drugs. So again, I was just I know that you're anti-drug war, but for the listeners, if you could just maybe expand a little bit about your thoughts, what you would like to do as far as drug policy.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about Prohibition and alcohol prohibition was it was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the actual event that was the real catalyst, and people said, for God's sakes, this isn't working. Mm-hmm. And it took a lot. Actually, the Midwest really fought the lifting of Prohibition. But, once Prohibition got lifted, I mean, all these guys like Al Capone, it just disappeared overnight. Mm-hmm. And, and
the murder rate dropped significantly.
Yeah, and then, politicians and such couldn't get their bribes anymore. So, it's like they had to go live like the rest of us. But we know what works, and that's the maddening thing about it. But again, when I say, it's like you always have to look at it from their standpoint. It's not working for us, but it's working for them.
Right. Them meaning those on Capitol Hill.
Look down in Mexico. I mean, 30,000 are being murdered a year. Mm-hmm. And you would think that would tell. There's an excellent book, Kings of Cocaine, how Colombia was completely ruined the people who really tried, what was so sad about it was that the people who really tried to do something about it and couldn't be bought, they were murdered. That's what happens.
Well, I mean, it's still very
the
much...
Plata. The Plomo Plata.
Yeah.
It's
it's
like...
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much money to be made. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody whacked me. I mean, it's like, if I actually had a platform,
right.
And not trying to be melodramatic about it, but
right.
When you're cutting into somebody, people get shot for no reason.
Right.
$10 million is a 10 million reasons, to shoot somebody, but they allow it to happen. It's like people know about Hamid Karzai and his brother. Afghanistan's a narco state.
Absolutely.
And, and the Taliban, we got that all going to overthrow the communist-supported secular government. And the Taliban then got rid of, 95% of opium production. And now it's way above that. And, way above any pre-war level. And I mean, we're very selective in who we want to go after.
Right,
and,
absolutely.
And look at I forget which bank, I don't want to say which one, but if you remember, what was it, 100 million or billions laundering for, the most violent
that's another one where you can throw the dart against the wall. You're probably thinking HSBC. I mean, that's the biggest one. I mean, they literally received wiretap information over, listening to cartel members in Mexico saying that their bank was the favored bank. I mean, there's so much evidence against them. Nobody went to prison. They paid a fine.
Yeah, they paid a fine. Like, again, 10% of their, but yet let's go after, every nitwit with a rock of, well, now Sessions and Trump are talking about we need to execute, meth, people who, smoke and deal small amounts of meth, and it's like, well, what about child murderers, pedophiles, and murderers, rapist murderers? What about that? I mean, again, it's like this hyperventilating, speech out of these people, but yet it's to me, I'm like just rolling my eyes, It's like, well, what about the people who really do us harm?
Right. One of the things, I read your thesis, I forget the exact title, but it's really the same thing.
Well,
that you
Tribal Soldiers of Vietnam is the book on Amazon. It had a different...
Oh, okay.
I mean, the thesis was a case study that had, the usual long... So I just shortened it, Tribal Soldiers of Vietnam,
Gotcha.
And then, did a print on demand, and it's on Amazon with that. So anyway.
Oh, okay. But one of the things, I've skimmed it over, but one of the things you point to in the book, and it's something you just alluded to earlier, you reference some of Alfred McCoy's work. He's, in my opinion, he's really the first author who really pointed out there's so many lies in the drug war, but the biggest lie, meaning that the U.S. government basically been in bed with some of the biggest drug dealers on the planet.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned Hamid Karzai.
Yeah, Doug Valentine wrote a great book on that. Yeah. And Alfred McCoy, Doug Valentine, and about the whole drug war, at the initial beginnings, yes.
Absolutely. And it's not like a one-time thing. This has been going on for decades.
Oh, yeah.
You linked on your Facebook a story. It's a guy who it's definitely been on my radar, about a guy named Haji Juma Khan. I think I'm pronouncing it right.
Yeah.
He was one of the biggest drug traffickers in Afghanistan. One of the things they didn't mention in the article, I've read a little bit about him in my own book, but he was actually captured in 2001 by U.S. forces. He was released. Then, again, he was already a very big drug trafficker. His empire grows. Meanwhile, he's on the CIA and DEA's payroll because he's providing information. And he stayed that way for about 7 years, and he flew back to the U.S. a couple times, provided information on their enemies. But once he was no longer useful, that's when they threw him in prison. But here's where the story gets interesting. That was about 2008-ish, if I remember, when he was thrown in prison. And now I'm referring to the story on your Facebook page. He was just released very quietly released. Again, this person that they made this big hoopla, they captured, the king, the opium king, quietly released by the U.S. government.
Yeah, the one poisoning our children,
Right. And it gets back to basically my point that, like what I'm talking about with Project Cassandra there, how the drug war in many ways, it's really just sort of this bargaining chip in geopolitics. And there's, you mentioned Karzai's brother, he was very helpful in our war effort over there, but he was also a major drug trafficker, as was, really most of Karzai's inner circle. And meanwhile, many of them were on the U.S. government's payroll when they had these very conflicting roles. They're helping the war effort, but they're also funding the opioid epidemic that's killing so many people.
Yeah, you could talk to any Afghan vet, just about any, and they were told, they walked through the opium fields and they were told, you do not touch these things because we don't want to, get this guy angry and, he's going to start throwing mortars into our base camp.
Right.
People come back like that. It's you can come back with stories. When I was in Vietnam, what McCoy was writing, he has the photographs in his book. It was these little, I think it was a gram of heroin, something like that. And it was these very well manufactured little plastic see-through capsules. And that's what all of it came in. Whenever anybody bought it, wasn't in an envelope or plastic bag or whatever. It was in these things, So, obviously they had a production house somewhere, like a Coke bottling plant, It's like,
and meanwhile, these were the people who our intelligence officials were hip to hip with, who were training and looking the other way, and in some cases even flying out on Air America aircraft, using their aircraft.
Yeah, and the top South Vietnamese officials.
Right.
But it worked on both sides, and in the First Indochina War, they noted that all of the Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese invasions, all happened during opium harvest season. And so they were trying to get as much opium as possible. It's actually in my book, and Alfred McCoy actually said, I think it was like a ton of opium would outfit an entire Viet Minh division.
Right.
And so the French were trying to, that's how they got involved in the opium trade themselves, trying to deny it, and, using the Corsican mafia. And actually, Dien Bien Phu was supposed to be their mooring point to go out and disrupt, the Viet Minh from collecting the opium. It's actually still classified what Dien Bien Phu, the reason and, what else they were trying to do at Dien Bien Phu is actually still classified. But at any rate, it's both sides use it. It's guns, drugs, and antiquities are the top three for, black market, illegal, where you're going to get hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
Those are the top three.
Yeah, in many ways, basically, our government is just sort of managing who is getting to control those black market resources.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We want our friends to get it.
Right. No, there's a quote, I'm going to paraphrase it. I don't remember which general said it, but he goes, "Up in these hills, opium is currency." That and that is the way of life. And there's multiple ways of looking at it. And again, I get it. You have these different agencies with extremely different missions. The CIA, they got to go win the war, so they're going to do that. But what's just so awful is that, okay, I get that, but we can't have this war on drugs and still be locking people up when we know that this is all a lie.
Oh, no, the hypocrisy of it is just...
It's stunning.
I think sometimes people just want to run away and scream. It's like it's overload of information. But, what motivates me is, people have said, well, you're just one person, what are you going to do? I said, I'm not going to shut up.
Right, absolutely.
If I'm elected to Congress,
right,
it's every day I get to talk in the well, and I'm going to bring up the most uncomfortable crap that anybody can. And I am just going to podcast write on and on and on, and get Congressional Research Service to do reports. So I think one person can sort of ignite a bonfire, but I could only do it for 2 years. I mean, especially at my age, but I think nobody would want to hang around for that long. It's like, I have a permit to carry, and I'd have to have one up there too. I like to go to restaurants and eat, and I don't want to always, be looking at the door.
Well, and it's something you mentioned earlier, and you were saying it right again, not to be melodramatic, because in the United States, politicians, for the most part, are extremely safe, but there's actually a really alarming study that came out about a month ago down in Mexico. There's an election season, and there have literally been about 90 candidates have been murdered in Mexico. And again, it's almost entirely connected to organized crime. We're not in that.
And journalists, and
I'm just them as well. But 90 hopeful public officials murdered.
Yeah.
And that's within a year's time. I mean, it's just stunning. How different that is across the border, and most of those problems are directly related to our drug prohibition.
I mean, it is, and we're forcing them. I mean, Mexico wanted to decriminalize weed. Oh, come on, and we just came down like a ton of bricks on them over that.
Right.
And what is it, Uruguay or Paraguay wanted to, there's a difference between legalize and decriminalize, but, either one is fine by me,
Right. Well, Uruguay actually has legalized it. And for the most part, it's been a pretty positive thing for them. One of the things that really has harmed their country, and it's a low violence country, but some of it is the spillover from drug war related crime from Colombia that comes across their border there. It's really awful stuff. One of the things I wanted to touch upon, because again, you're pointing to the hypocrisy of the drug war, and there's a bill Bernie Sanders is sponsoring it. I don't remember the exact title. Opioid manufacturers accountability
bill, something like that. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't have a co-sponsor, as far as I know. It doesn't have a companion bill in the House.
It has 3 co-sponsors.
Oh, really?
So far, yeah.
Just no success. And the thing is, and we all know that Bernie, he's very strong as far as holding the corporate criminals accountable. This bill, for people who aren't familiar, it's a very much a compromise bill. It's he's not even talking about criminal penalties. He's just talking about, a higher accountability as far as fines and regulation. And again, it basically has no chance so far of passing. Reading between the lines, is that if you were elected, is that something that you would like to support on the House side?
Well, actually, I would have to say no, because I find it a con. And, this whole opioid crisis, 400,000, if people are really worried about, Americans are dying because of this, 400,000 die from cigarettes, 100,000 from alcohol, and you go down the list, and, opioids and such, they've created a chaotic mess with all of that. There are people who need, opioids, but again, the cannabis with the CBD, you take the THC out and CBD, it can't help everybody with a certain type of pain. It helps like children with MS and such. It's not a panacea for everybody for, certain types of pain. My wife and I have watched a number of specials on TV, and people suddenly get up and walk, after taking 2 puffs. And, but yet, and actually, if these so-called Republican, right-wingers look at under Nixon, the Schaefer Commission, appointed by Nixon. Schaefer was a Republican governor, and they got all the doctors and everybody. And he said, it's actually medicinal and it doesn't harm anybody, 0 overdoses and such. But Nixon, this is all well known. Nixon, because of the anti-war stuff, he wanted to be able to go after, Black Panthers and such, and the
use
college
that as
kids who were
the pretense, right? Use the drug wars.
yeah, and so he said, well, to hell with it. And, it's like, I don't care what they said. This is what I want to do. And, I mean, you can go right back to the Schaefer Commission. And, I mean, this is not just, somebody sprinkling twinkle dust over a report and saying, hey, sounds good to me. I mean, these are doctors and lawyers and such who really, put the effort in to study it. Right. And, we're not going to fund this. And, as a vet who suffered from PTSD, it's anecdotal about, cannabis, certain types of cannabis, and even ecstasy. And, it's like, well, let's find out.
Right.
Let's stop jerking around. I mean, 22 vets are committing suicide a day.
Right.
Why don't we find out what works?
Let's not block the research. If you say that if it's bunk, let's stop blocking clinical research and just allow it to happen, and let's see how that goes.
Yeah, and actually Israel is leading the world in cannabis research.
Oh,
yeah. And they have particular strains for particular diseases. This isn't coming out of, Kathmandu or something.
Right. This is well-established research.
Yeah, these are legitimate doctors who are, doing clinical trials. And, they were showing the patients and stuff and, doing actual clinical trials. And the guy said, I can watch this. I give this guy the placebo, nothing's happening. And I'm giving the guy the real one, and they're walking around.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's other countries, but it's, again, as long as Big Pharma is, as long as everybody's a sock puppet up there, the 435 congressmen and 100 senators are taking money from Big Pharma. The party leaders, you see Feinstein and, one would think better out of a Democrat, so to say, but Feinstein and Pelosi are just totally opposed to, all of that because, hey, it's working for them.
Absolutely. Both parties, exactly. Big Pharma has fought this stuff tooth and nail, even though there are several, pharmaceutical companies that are putting patents on cannabis medicine. And if they can monopolize the market, that's the only way that they want that.
Yeah, the cannabinoid, the CBD. Yeah,
right.
Through hemp. Again, it's unfortunate. It's a trial and error with a lot of people who try, cannabis, medical, marijuana and cannabis, and some shops are good at it, and this is what I understand. However, if you were to go to Israel, you get some real science.
Right, we're decades behind the curve on that one. You mentioned it, Big Pharma. It's definitely another one of your issues. Maybe tell the listeners a little bit about your thoughts about what you would like to do to sort of combat or point out some of the problems of Big Pharma. There are two laws that are already on the books. 85% of drugs are produced at our expense, but we're not, a socialist country, so we don't have our own, drug manufacturing, building company, what have you, that would produce at cost and then give it to Americans, which I think Americans would like that part of socialism. It does. Polling, that seems to be pretty popular, right?
Yeah. But, they give the patent to Congress, and Congress votes who they're going to give the patent to. Do they give it to Mylan or Merck, or who are they going to give it to? So now you see, that's why these guys go work for Big Pharma after they're a congressman. Because, they're the ones who arranged for this $10 billion drug to go to that company. So it's like, well, I want my $10 million a year job, in exchange for that. But at any rate, even there's plenty of doctors I talk about. They don't know about the revoking of a patent, and that Congress could actually, and let's just say EpiPen, which costs $5 to produce, but they sell it for $400 or $500, and is a life-saving drug. And that's
right.
What actually the revocation of patent and march-in rights is the other law. They exist specifically for that. Like if something is a life-saving drug and, people are just gouging on it, then, we actually have the legal right, and I would say obligation
Right.
to go in and take it away and then just give the patent to the world and say whoever wants to make it, and, people can pick, like buying soap or deodorant. You got 10 different varieties of this stuff. It's like with Mylanta, I mean, they're not even saying, look, with the EpiPen, they're not even saying, look, you lower this down to $30 and we'll let you keep the patent.
Right, not even negotiate, not even using the threat, not as a negotiating ploy.
Yeah, I mean, they don't even have the guts to get up and say that.
I'm not aware of... Oh, go ahead.
No, but I'm just saying, if I were elected to Congress, again, I wouldn't shut up.
Right.
I would be every day about, come on, guys, get off it. Mm-hmm. And let's start with EpiPen, because it's children that it's used for. And, bee stings and stuff. And it's, quit being so damn corrupt. It's like, we tell them $30 or we take it back and, anybody can make it. And I mean, I just wouldn't shut up until, they would finally do it and the dam would burst. Right. But I'm saying, maybe that's a fantasy, but, either way, like I said, somebody has to get up and say it.
Somebody at least needs to fight that fight. I don't really know of too many instances in which the government has used that power. Do you know of any off the top of your head?
No, I don't. It's been, the laws were actually, one of those laws was enacted in the 60s as sort of a secondary like alarm bell, or again to use as sort of a hammer about, hey, knock it off. But this is really quite a new phenomenon where somebody is buying now patents, and they're going in and buying the patent, and then like Skrelly, upping it 1,500%.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
And now it's like it's a gold rush now, because if you've noticed, a lot of drugs have gone up. There was one Reslimed. It was $115.
What is that drug? I'm not familiar with that.
I think it's an anti-cancer. It's used in seniors.
Okay.
And it went in 1 year. I think it was last year. It went from $115 to $690 per month, and right now it's $16,000 a month. Yeah. I mean, and it's like. I was kind of.
The mafia wouldn't even do something like that.
Well, they're watching. I mean, the Russian mafia, skimmed billions off of our Medicare years ago.
Well, actually, Italian American mafia, they're involved in the healthcare fraud schemes as well, on a much smaller level. They're starting to get into the sophisticated, white collar crime as well. And that's really kind of one of the things that I've been pounding the table about, is when it's somebody from an actual organized crime organization that's involved in these type of white-collar crimes, that's when the government does hit them with the hammer. They go after that. But when it's a corporation, I mean, it's like we were talking about before, it's the same thing. Fine, deferred prosecution agreement, promise not to do it again, even though you've done it 6 times in the past. And it goes back to your basic platform of against corporate crime. Again, maybe tell folks a little bit about what your thoughts, what you'd like to do to really counter against corporate crime.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's probably a much more difficult fight than drugs. I think that if you did you'd know better than I, but I mean, if you were to interview people about corporate crime, I think their eyes glaze over and they don't really know. And, the FBI only collects statistics on, nitwits carjacking and, robbing a bank and such. And supposedly it's like about $5 billion a year in crime and 5,000 people are killed.
Oh,
it's in a variety of...
Oh, much higher than that, actually. It's much higher.
Well, no. I mean, I'm talking about street crime.
Yeah. I was going to say, just even
corporate
healthcare
crime
fraud
is like
alone.
$500 billion minimum.
Yeah.
And 50,000 people. And, when people, well, what are you talking about? And it's like, look, we're talking shoddy construction. We're talking about, vehicles, planes not being made properly and crashing. Windows blowing out of airplanes, and the various tainted meats and ice cream and on and on. And they never go. I have an example there. It was like the hot dogs of a company. And because they had this huge contract with the military to provide hot dogs, nothing was done to them, and 21 people died.
Oh, yeah.
And, when they saw that their hot dogs were tainted, they just stopped testing.
Oh, yeah. There's
and I mean, yeah. And nobody goes to jail. Nobody in Wall Street went to jail, and it's like, I mean, and that was just, I think that goes to show how we're so third world now. I mean, Reagan put over 1,000 in jail of the SNL.
Yeah, it was actually close to about 2,000 people actually went to prison. We're talking high-level operators, even people who were politically entrenched.
Yeah, right? McCain. Remember McCain got embarrassed with that, the Five?
The Keating Five, right.
Yeah, the Keating Five, yeah.
Right, he was the big SNL guy out there in Arizona. For people who aren't familiar, he basically had like 5 different senators essentially on his payroll. And when the scandal broke out, he was asked if he thought that money would help him out. I'm paraphrasing something. He's like, "Yeah, it better."
Yeah, I know.
And he, McCain and different, politicians, they basically try to intervene with regulators to get him off of his back. But he, again, this is a guy deeply entrenched within the Republican Party. He actually had a position on Nixon's staff, or at least a commission, I should say. But he went to prison, and again, he only went to prison for a few years and some, federal, fairly soft, right. But the fact is, the guy actually had to go to prison, and it's a very different story this time around. And I think it has mainly to do with that revolving door, where again, the public official, he gets to go and make 10 times as much in the private sector, either defending those corporations or even getting jobs directly with them, like with the example of Comey. There's just so much. It's that revolving door.
And Obama's
Eric Holder.
Eric Holder, yeah.
Oh, his whole staff.
He worked directly. Yeah, he worked directly, and he was on the attorneys who work with the MERS system, the MERS, the electronic real estate.
Exactly. Covington and Burling. Yeah, Covington and Burling. They represented all kinds of corporate criminals. So he gets to go in there, make and still a very good living, like just under $200,000 as the Attorney General. But then he gets to go make $4 or $5 million when he goes back to that same corporation that defends the corporate criminals. And it's not just him; it's just a whole array of his staff that jumped into the DOJ and then jumped
Lanny
right
Brewer, it's just it's like.
But you kind of pointed to something that you and I would say see directly eye to eye on, because you're mentioning prison reform, how the low level criminal who say steals $100 from some department store, that person actually goes to jail, versus these high level corporate criminals, they don't even pretend to send them to jail.
Yeah.
Do you really have any thoughts on what you would do as far as the criminal justice system if you were elected?
Well, there's a couple of things. First and foremost, if we really even just took the minor step of decriminalization, and what, the difference between legalizing and decriminalizing is that, leave it up to the states. Decriminalize it, and if the state wants to buy into it, fine. If they don't, fine. It's the same with prostitution, bordellos and things like that. In Nevada, prostitution is not legal. It's decriminalized. And each county has the right to say, no, you guys are a big problem, move out, which is why they're all on, I lived in California, but which is why they're on trailers on wheels. If they have to move it to a different county, that's what they do.
Well, right. It's legalized within the county, but decriminalized throughout the state, right?
Yeah, and so they have a right to say, it's like, hey, you're a public nuisance is basically what they say. You're jamming up the highway or making too much noise.
Right.
But at any rate, it's let's say we were able to get rid of the drug war. I mean, 600,000. Well, we went under Reagan from 500,000 prisoners, which is still a bit high. for what our population was. But we now have 2.2 million. Right. And they're sending people just for really literally nothing. And I ran one on my, I think I did, on my Facebook of a woman who, all she did, they caught her, and she's doing 20 years. All they did was come back, and she drew a map for these people, and they said, oh, conspiracy. And she herself took medical marijuana and was, legally involved in the state, sale and such. And it was a map, actually, of how to get from, point A to point B, but it went through a, federal forest. The prosecutor decides to be, a big shot, and he sent her away. Never been in any problem, but, they don't recognize, the feds don't recognize, legal marijuana in, whatever state, California or whatever. So what if you have a, medical license and, and it's legal within the state? We don't recognize it. They sent her away for 20 years just for drawing that map, and they said, oh, you drew this map so that you could help these people, get around police checkpoints. Right. And it's like, no, I didn't, but yet it's a federal court, and, they want to play games. But
a lot of career prosecutors out there.
Yeah, well, he's the next Comey, but at any rate, or Eric Holder, there's another one. But, it's West Europe has 300 million people. All prisoners they have are 600,000, which is basically the same number of marijuana.
Yeah.
And, they're just overreaching and sending people in. And it's really almost a tax on a poor family, because then they're privatizing and
Okay, sorry about that, little technical difficulties. But Dave, you were telling me about your experience working with prisons.
Yeah, so it's my father was a street cop, and then he was a prison warden, and then he was basically like a chief magistrate in California. And at any rate, and he worked on some, prison reforms, such as there was no halfway house. And my father was one of the co-founders. I actually, at one point, I wish I could find it to get a photo. I think there were about 6 or some odd guys who worked on that in California to start it. And, guys were just kicked out of the prison and, with prison cardboard shoes and $100 or whatever, and told to fend for themselves. And so the recidivism rate was really high. And so, he started this where they'd have like 90 days and be with a counselor, and they'd have a place free to stay. And, they would then have help getting a driver's license, a job, and they just wouldn't be, totally overwhelmed. And we've gone numerous steps back since prisons are being privatized, and the guards are paid minimum wage and such, and they don't know what the hell they're doing. And prisoners are also, with the privatization, it's profit over anything. And they're not being given their meds because that would add costs to a prison. And the other thing is they have to go to a commissary and buy food. They're just not given enough food or good food. And so that falls again on the family, so poor people are having to cough up a couple $100 a month. So their father, brother, sister, what have you, basically doesn't starve and can have a balanced diet. And just say Norway has the best system, but people can look that up, and they had a special I saw on the Norwegian guy came to visit Attica, and he was just shocked. It was like, he said, well, in Norway, the prison guards actually play chess or whatever with the prisoners. They interact. And prisoners are given, well-balanced meals, and they actually cook them themselves for like a socialization effect. And he was looking at Attica, and they were given like a stale bun and literally a stale bun and a hot dog, and he said, that's not enough to live off of. they'd show him the commissary, right? He's like just shaking his head. But I mean, we've gone from 500,000 to 2 point under Reagan, 1980 to 2.2, and everybody likes to say we got to get tough on crime, but we're not really getting. We've gone through all those topics of corporate criminals, and this country's still up for sale from politicians and corporate criminals, bankers, etc. So they're not really doing anything except throwing a lot of poor people who don't have any real attorneys in jail.
Right.
And they don't have a support group when they get out, and so churches are kind of filling that need.
Right. We really don't put much effort into rehabilitation. It's this system that really it preys upon the weak, and I like to give the analogy of essentially like a bully. A defendant who can really fight back. Most prosecutors, they hand out they negotiate much tougher with the with the people who really can't fight back. Like the example you're talking of, the woman who's mildly connected to some conspiracy, some drug conspiracy at best. But meanwhile, the major players, they get the real deals. They're the ones who get the snitch, and they're the ones who actually usually end up getting less time. It's this reverse system, that's just backwards, basically, really in every way.
Yeah, like you said, that look at the guys at HSBC. They have them on tape, talking about they actually were involved in a conspiracy, and they're not going for 20 years. But yet, a woman, they have nothing but a map.
Right. That's a perfect
in her
example.
handwriting, and and she was legally involved in medical marijuana or whichever. I mean, she was legally involved in it. But the prosecutor decides to make a name for himself, and it's like, well, I'm not going to go after, big billionaire bankers or whatever. So yeah, I'll go after this poor woman with 2 kids.
Right, who would basically have to bankrupt herself in order to properly fight back.
Yeah, there are people their parents are bankrupting themselves by taking a second mortgage on their house to try and defend somebody, and it's just not. And if you go to court, you get an extra 8 years. That's the average. But if you actually accept a plea bargain and you find out the guy screwed you and sent you for 10 years when sentencing guideline was 3, you cannot go back and ask for a sentence reduction.
Right. There's an unofficial tax for actually taking your case to trial.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say we need more folks like yourself. I really hope that people,
you say that.
Actually representing us as public officials. I probably disagree with you on a few issues, and you've got a pretty
I disagree with my wife of 40 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell people, hey, I don't agree 100% with her, and she doesn't with me either. So,
exactly.
I mean, that's life.
I've yet to find a politician who I can agree on everything.
Yeah.
Like I say, you put your platform out there, and you're very clear in what you think, which is highly unusual.
Yeah, very specific.
I
Most politicians are just, they're just wishy-washy. And I don't know, people say, they're wishy-washy, but there's like 19 points there, and on most of what we spoke about, and even my Facebook page, David Moore for Congress, and it's daveforcongress.org is the actual website with the issues and links and stuff. I'll be linking to this, and I have a link on the other one to you. I'm now working on the website again.
Okay, so just basically a final note, if you would tell the listeners how to get in touch or how to follow you, some basic info like that.
Well, I have a mailing address which is Dave for Congress, which is Box 427. Salem, South Carolina, 29676. And there are organizations that like to send questionnaires. And Dave for Congress 2018. And you could, right on the Dave for Congress org, there is a contact. You could just click on that and send an email. If they want to send a personal email, they can send it to dkmoore2003@gmail.com. And then, or they can go through the Facebook page, the David Moore for, I think it says for U.S. Congress.
Okay. Well, fantastic. And I really invite the listeners to check it out. Again, this is a platform here that I think is truly devoid of financial conflicts of interest, which is really what's ruining Congress. All right. So on that note,
Okay.
I'd say that that should wrap up this podcast. Everybody, check out his website and let's go support Dave. You got anything to add there?
No, I don't, but thanks much. Thanks much I enjoyed our conversation, and they should check out your books. I read your books, and that was the primary thing why I contacted you. It was like, yeah, this I like, this, you know what you're talking about with, I'm against making, I'm all for decriminalizing or legalizing prostitution, the sex trade or whatever. Anytime there's laws against anything, drug war, prostitution, gambling you have on, anytime there's laws against it, it goes underground and you got nothing but problems and violence, and particularly violence against women. And you're just absolutely right in, the 3 books that you have on, the drug war. I would tell people that you really need to read your 3 books, that you're absolutely right on that. It's like prohibition of any kind I'm just totally opposed to that.
Wow. Well, thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Wow. All right. So on that note, I guess we're going to wrap up this episode. It's been a pleasure, and thanks so much. We'll talk to you again.
Okay.
Have a great one.
Have a good day.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000, plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross, of all 4 hotels in the store. Corleone,